Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into a question many of us might be grappling with as virtual reality, or VR, moves from, a niche technology to something far more integrated into our lives. We're going to explore its profound psychological and societal implications, focusing really on a critical distinction. Does VR constitute a fundamentally new and potentially more potent form of behavioral addiction? Something truly distinct from the screen-based compulsions we're already quite familiar with. I'll be arguing that VR indeed presents a heightened and unique addictive potential.
And I'll be offering a perspective that views VR addiction more as an extension, perhaps, of existing digital compulsions, emphasizing comparable prevalence rates, and also some inherent mitigating factors that I think are quite important.
Exactly. It's a discussion that's becoming increasingly relevant, especially as VR technology becomes more accessible, more sophisticated.
Right. And understanding the nuances of its psychological impact is absolutely critical. It demands a very careful, evidence-based examination. I'm looking forward to exploring the different angles here.
So my core position is this. Virtual reality's unparalleled immersion and the unique sense of embodiment it fosters don't just amplify existing risks. They create a truly distinct and heightened potential for behavioral addiction. Unlike simply looking at content on a traditional screen, VR is meticulously engineered to completely replace your physical surroundings. It aims for a deep state of presence, where your brain is effectively, tricked into accepting the virtual environment as real. We've seen preliminary research, for example, suggesting that VR gaming might have a 44% higher addiction tendency compared to traditional PC gaming. Now, this isn't a small difference. It's attributed directly to the much more intense pleasure and reward delivered by a fully immersive 3D experience. But it goes deeper than that. The real game changer, I think, is embodiment. That powerful, subjective feeling that your virtual avatar is your physical body. This isn't just controlling a character, it's being a character, inhabiting a new self. This phenomenological shift offers a qualitatively different and, I would argue, far more potent form of escapism, making it particularly alluring for individuals wrestling with, say, low self-esteem or a negative body image in the real world. From a neurobiological standpoint, VR addiction seems deeply rooted in its powerful engagement of the brain's dopamine pathways and reward circuits, those chemical highways that make us feel pleasure and drive motivation. This is consistent with what we see in both substance use disorders and other established behavioral addictions, and it potentially leads to structural brain changes that can impair executive functions, those higher-level cognitive skills that help us plan and self-regulate. What truly highlights VR's power, for me, is its exceptional ability to generate realistic, high-fidelity cues.
This is a mechanism we even leverage therapeutically in cue exposure therapy to help people overcome addiction. Yet, paradoxically, it also demonstrates VR's profound capacity to drive the formation and maintenance of compulsive behaviors. It's in essence a highly effective craving generator, making that virtual experience feel almost tangible.
Okay. While I certainly acknowledge and, frankly, even appreciate the incredibly compelling and immersive nature of virtual reality experiences, they are powerful. I believe the claim that VR represents a fundamentally new and inherently more dangerous class of addiction requires a much closer, more critical look. Right now, the empirical data simply doesn't seem to support the idea that VR is sparking some widespread addiction crisis beyond what we already observe with other forms of digital media. When researchers have actually looked at the prevalence of compulsive VR use, they've found rates typically ranging between 2% and 20%. And critically, this spectrum is remarkably comparable to the prevalence we see for addiction to non-VR video games and even social networking sites.
So what that suggests, at present anyway, is that VR applications may not actually possess a significantly higher addictive potential than many other engaging technologies we've been navigating for years now. Moreover, and this is a key point for me, many popular VR experiences have practical, inherent factors that naturally mitigate against prolonged compulsive use. Think about it. A lot of popular VR applications are physically demanding. You're often required to stand, to move your entire body, to, exert yourself. Games like Beat Saber or Super Hot VR can be quite a workout. This physical fatigue often acts as a kind of natural break on session length, and this contrasts quite sharply with the largely sedentary nature of traditional gaming or, say, endless scrolling on social media, which often allows for much more prolonged, uninterrupted, and physically passive engagement. So rather than seeing VR as this entirely new, unprecedented class of addiction, I view it more as an evolution, maybe, of existing patterns of digital engagement and potential misuse, operating within similar risk profiles, and importantly, in some cases, even possessing unique self-limiting aspects.
I see why you emphasize those prevalence rates and the physical aspects, and they are valid points to consider. But let's delve deeper into what I consider the true differentiating factor, the quality of the psychological experience itself. The distinction isn't just about how long someone plays, but how they're engaging psychologically. VR's total sensory immersion isn't just a feature, it's meticulously designed to effectively trick the brain into accepting the virtual environment as genuinely real, achieving that coveted state of presence. This fundamentally alters how a user psychologically engages compared to, say, staring at a flat 2D screen. There's a cognitive shift happening there. And then there's embodiment, that profound feeling that you are the avatar, that its actions are your actions, its body your body. This doesn't just create a deeper sense of self within the virtual world. It essentially allows you to build an alternate self. This offers an unparalleled level of escapism and psychological reward that, for many, is profoundly more compelling and therefore, I would argue, more addictive, especially, as I mentioned, for individuals actively seeking to escape negative real-world self-perceptions or perhaps even significant body image issues. We're talking about a level of psychological refuge that I think far exceeds what a traditional screen can typically offer.
Okay, I agree that the presence and immersive quality of VR are powerful, no question. And for some individuals, it undeniably elevates the experience. However, I think we need to carefully consider its actual measured impact on addiction tendency within the broader context of highly engaging digital experiences we already understand, rather than focusing perhaps too much on the potential for a unique psychological state. The brain's reward system, as you rightly pointed out earlier, responds to novelty and engagement across a vast array of platforms. It's not exclusive to VR. That 44% higher addiction tendency figure you mentioned, while certainly a flag and something to monitor carefully, it does come from a preliminary study. And a tendency, indicates a propensity or maybe intensity of engagement, but it doesn't automatically translate to a new, widespread category of clinical addiction, especially when we consider the scope and duration of many such initial studies.
But the intensity itself could be the critical factor.
Possibly, but it's also crucial to highlight again those practical, physical demands of VR. Consider popular games like Beat Saber or Super Hot VR. You're not passively sitting there. You're actively dodging, swinging, moving your entire body. 20 or 30 minutes of that can be a genuine workout, creating a natural fatigue that intrinsically limits those prolonged, uninterrupted sessions we often associate with sedentary PC gaming or, endless social media scrolling. It's almost as if the hardware itself, in many popular cases, is imposing a natural break, something traditional screens often don't do nearly as effectively.
Well, while the physical aspect might offer some limitation for certain, perhaps more active games, I think we're missing the forest for the trees if we don't acknowledge the undeniable neurobiological foundation here. The evidence isn't just speculative. VR taps into the exact same dopamine pathways and principles of operant conditioning, that's essentially learning through rewards and punishments, that underpin established behavioral and even substance addictions. When VR stimulates these dopamine pathways, it's hitting the brain's pleasure button, much like a gambler feels that rush or how someone gets a kick from social media likes, but now it's potentially intensified by the sheer realness of the virtual experience. The capacity of VR to effectively trigger dopamine release and create incredibly powerful, high-fidelity environmental cues, well, it means it directly manipulates the brain's reward system in a way that could undeniably drive addiction. Think of it this way. If a traditional game shows you a tempting reward on screen, VR can thrust you into that rewarding environment, making the brain's craving response potentially much more powerful.
Right.
And this is precisely why VR is used therapeutically in cue exposure therapy for addiction recovery. It demonstrates its potent ability to induce cravings. The very mechanism we use to help people recover from addiction can, in uncontrolled settings, be misused for compulsive behavior. It's a craving generator, as I said, in the purest sense, whose impact really depends entirely on its programmed intent and the context of its use.
I fully agree that VR certainly engages the brain's reward system powerfully. But again, this is a characteristic it shares with numerous other engaging activities and technologies, from gambling to even things like collecting or intense hobby engagement, right? The existence of these shared neurobiological pathways doesn't automatically classify VR as a more potent or indeed a new class of addiction. The critical point for me remains the observed prevalence rates. At that 2 to 20% range, these rates are consistently comparable to existing technology addictions. If VR were a fundamentally more potent form of addiction, driving addiction in a uniquely powerful way, one would reasonably expect to see significantly higher, more distinct prevalence rates emerging in the general population, which current data simply doesn't consistently demonstrate yet. Furthermore, while the therapeutic use of VR in cue exposure therapy is fascinating and definitely powerful, it's a controlled intervention within a specific clinical setting. It's carefully managed, it's designed to mitigate risks, not amplify them. Using that as direct evidence for VR's uncontrolled use creating a uniquely higher addictive risk, well, that might be an overreach. The environment, the supervision, the therapeutic goals, these are all vastly different from someone simply putting on a headset at home unsupervised. Context is key here.
That's a compelling argument about context, I grant you that. But I think the deepest concern, for me at least, lies in VR's profound capacity for escapism, particularly for vulnerable individuals. Think about someone actively searching for an escape from daily struggles, maybe loneliness, maybe anxiety, a place where they can truly be someone else entirely. Those with pre-existing mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, or perhaps a chronic lack of real-world social connections are, I believe, highly susceptible. For these individuals, the curated and often more controllable social interactions and the sheer ability to inhabit idealized avatars in virtual environments offer a psychological refuge that feels qualitatively different and potentially far more potent as a form of self-medication than anything traditional social media could likely offer. With social media, you're often presenting an idealized version of yourself. Maybe. In VR, you can effectively become an idealized version. This deeper psychological immersion, I worry, risks fostering greater social isolation and a more profound withdrawal from physical reality. It could lead to negative impacts on well-being specifically for these vulnerable users, impacts that might easily exceed what we've seen before, simply because the virtual world feels so real, so truly inhabitable.
Yeah, and while it is absolutely true that individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions are more vulnerable to technology addiction, that's a consistent finding across virtually all digital platforms, unfortunately, not unique to VR. The concerns about escapism and social isolation and their impact on mental health have been extensively linked to the overuse of social media and online gaming long before widespread VR adoption. I mean, we've been talking about this for years. In fact, the source material itself indicates that high involvement in social VR platforms negatively impacts well-being specifically for users already experiencing low self-esteem and social disconnection in their real lives. This strongly highlights, I think, that VR in many instances appears to amplify existing vulnerabilities and predispositions rather than creating entirely new forms of psychological distress or addiction from scratch. The core issue, then, isn't necessarily the technology itself being fundamentally different in kind, but rather how it interacts with and potentially exacerbates underlying human vulnerabilities that are already present. Therefore, while vigilance is certainly necessary and we absolutely need to design these platforms responsibly, these challenges don't strike me as fundamentally different in kind or scale than those society is already grappling with in the broader digital age. It feels more like a continuation, perhaps an intensification for some, but not a completely distinct paradigm shift in addiction itself.
Okay, so to summarize my position, I believe virtual reality truly presents a unique and heightened addictive potential. This isn't just an extension of existing digital compulsions. It feels like a qualitatively different experience. Its unparalleled immersive qualities, the profound sense of embodiment it can offer, and its direct, powerful engagement with the brain's reward system, they create a deeper psychological hook. The preliminary evidence that 44% higher addiction tendency in VR gaming, while preliminary, coupled with its proven efficacy in Q exposure therapy, underscores that VR is a potent tool for escapism with potentially deeper and more profound psychological consequences, particularly for vulnerable individuals. And this, I feel, demands a distinct, proactive approach to understanding and mitigating its risks, rather than simply lumping it in with other screen-based issues we already know.
And while I deeply respect the power of VR's immersive capabilities, my position remains that the current empirical data suggests its addictive potential falls squarely within the established spectrum of existing behavioral addictions, things like gaming and social media, with those comparable prevalence rates of 2% to 20%. Furthermore, we can't just overlook the practical mitigating factors, like the physical demands inherent in many popular VR experiences, which often serve as natural deterrents to excessive prolonged use in a way other technologies don't. Therefore, while continued research, vigilant monitoring, and responsible design are absolutely crucial as this technology evolves, no question about that, VR does not, at present, seem to constitute a fundamentally new class of addiction that operates entirely outside the known landscape of digital compulsions. Instead, I see it as a powerful evolution of how humans interact with technology, certainly bringing familiar challenges, perhaps amplified, but in a new, very compelling wrapper.
Yeah, this discussion really does highlight the dual nature of these immersive technologies, doesn't it? They offer profound benefits and incredible new experiences,
Absolutely.
but also pose unique challenges that definitely require our careful consideration as they become more integrated into our daily lives.
Agreed. There's clearly so much more to explore regarding their long-term societal impacts and, crucially, how we can best mitigate the potential risks while responsibly harnessing their, frankly, immense potential for positive change. Lots to keep an eye on.